This is chapter 22, the respiratory system. This is the last chapter that's in this next Unit 4 exam. All right, the basic function of the respiratory system, that's pretty easy. We're going to breathe in oxygen and we breathe out carbon dioxide. Breathing in is called inhale, breathing out is called exhale. Now there are 4 processes that make up respiration, and they're listed here, and then you can write down the definition. The first process is called pulmonary ventilation. Pulmonary ventilation is whenever air comes into and out of the lungs. So breathe in, pulmonary ventilation in, breathe out, pulmonary ventilation out. External respiration. Whenever you see the word respiration, think an exchange. We're exchanging gases, either oxygen for carbon dioxide or carbon dioxide for oxygen. So external respiration is the exchange of gas between the lungs and the pulmonary capillaries. We went over the pulmonary circulation earlier, I think in chapter 20. So external respiration is the exchange of gas between the lungs and the pulmonary capillaries. Oxygen is going to be going in, carbon dioxide will be going out into the alveolus. And then we have the transport of the respiratory gases. That's going to be using the cardiovascular system. The red blood cell carries the gas. The hemoglobin of the red blood cell is going to bind to oxygen or carbon dioxide. So it's going to transport the oxygen to the tissues, and then we have internal respiration. Internal respiration is an exchange of gas between the systemic capillaries and the surrounding tissues. Oxygen will leave the systemic circulation, carbon dioxide will go into the systemic circulation. This slide lists the different parts of the respiratory system. First we have the nose and then the nasal cavity. The nasal cavity is just used for air. Now you can also breathe in through the mouth and breathe out through the mouth. So inhale and exhale through the oral cavity. We're going to talk about the oral cavity and the digestive system, so we'll worry about that then. Right now we'll focus on some things in the nasal cavity. And then we have paranasal sinuses. The bones that surround the nose, they would be the paranasal bones. But these bones are not solid. They actually have empty spaces inside of the bone, and they're the sinuses. They're called paranasal sinuses because they're around the nose, and we'll go over those locations later. But for example, there's one in the frontal bone, so it's the frontal sinus. There's one in the maxillary bone, so it's the maxillary sinus, so on and so forth. And then we have the pharynx. The pharynx is an open passageway behind the nasal cavity, behind the oral cavity, and right above the larynx. The larynx is the voice box, and then we have the trachea. All of the parts that we've listed so far are part of the upper respiratory system. We can separate the respiratory system into upper and lower respiratory system. The rest of these are part of the lower respiratory system. So we have bronchi, which are passageways the inside of the lungs, which lead to smaller and smaller branches. The bronchi leads to a secondary bronchus, to a tertiary bronchus, and then we get into the smaller and smaller ducts, the alveolar ducts, and eventually we end up with the alveoli. And the alveoli are air sacs, and that's where we have the external respiration. That's wherever oxygen will cross through the respiratory membrane into the pulmonary capillaries, and carbon dioxide leaves the pulmonary capillaries and go into the alveolus. And then the alveoli and the bronchi and the smaller branches are all surrounded by the lungs. So if you have an infection in the nose, anywhere between the nose and the trachea, they call that an upper respiratory infection. And then if you have any type of infection below that, that's a lower respiratory infection. I'm going to go ahead and draw some lines to these structures. We have the nasal cavity, which is going to be right there. And then we have the nostril is the opening into the nasal cavity. Air goes in through the nostril and into the nasal cavity. Then we have the larynx. The larynx is your voice box. I'm going to draw a line that goes to right there. The trachea is your windpipe. So it's below the larynx, and it's that tube right there. There's a place where the trachea splits into the bronchial tree, the primary bronchus, and that is called the carina. So that is right there. It's an upside down V. And then we have the primary bronchus right next to it, right there. And then the left bronchus is going to be right there. And then we have the right lung right there. And then we have the left lung right there. The diaphragm is the muscle that separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity. That's the diaphragm right there. Let's go back up here on the right hand side. The oral cavity, that is your right beyond your lips. And the pharynx is the open airway behind the nasal and oral cavity. There's 3 parts to the pharynx. We'll go over that here in just a minute. And then we have the pleura. The parietal pleura, it's going to be the pleural sac that is on the outer part of the wall. You can see it's on the outer surface of the diaphragm, plus it's also on the inner surface of the thoracic cage. The entire airways of the respiratory system are separated or divided into a conducting zone and a respiratory zone. If the conducting zone, there is no gas exchange, so no gas exchange. The respiratory zone is where there is gas exchange in the lungs. So the alveoli, the air sacs, we definitely have gas exchange, but there's also a structure called an alveolar duct. And if it needs to, it can also exchange gas, but mostly it's going to be at the alveolus. The rest of the conducting zones are going to filter the air and take out any type of dust or pollutants that you're breathing in so it does not reach your lungs. It's going to humidify the air, which means it's going to put some moisture into the air because that's easier for the gas exchange to occur if it's humidified air. And then it's going to warm up the incoming air to body temperature because it's easier for the gas exchange if it's the same 98.6 body temperature that the rest of your body is. That's why it's harder to breathe in really cold air. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about the nose, but inside of the nose is the nasal cavity. The inside of the nasal cavity is lined with the mucosal membrane, and this mucosal membrane is going to help moisten or humidify the air, plus it also has the blood supply to it, so it can help warm the air as you enter through your nose. So that's why it's better to breathe in and out through your nose, because as you breathe out through your nose, it's going to try to reclaim most of that humidity and reclaim most of that warmth so that we can warm and humidify the air coming in through the nasal cavity. And then there's a mucosal layer that helps trap allergens and pollutants that you breathe in through your nose. And then we have the resonating chamber for speech. Your voice resonates through the chambers of your nose. And then there are receptors for your cranial nerve, number 1, for olfaction. The olfactory bulb lies on top of the ethmoid plate, and then the olfactory neurons dangle in the superior part of the nasal cavity so that it can detect odor molecules. There's 2 types of mucosal membranes inside of the nasal cavity. We have the olfactory mucosa, which contains the nerve endings for smell, and then the rest of it is the respiratory mucosa. And when it comes to the respiratory mucosa, it has a specific type of epithelium. It is PCCE, and we talked about this way back in chapter 4. It is pseudostratified. I'm just going to put pseudo, but pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. We only talked about PCCE, the pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, when it came to the respiratory passages. That was the only location I asked you to remember. So anytime we talk about respiratory mucosa, we're talking about the PCCE. Let's go through some of these structures. First, we have some paranasal sinuses. They are sinuses that surround the nose. We can see one here, and then we can see one here. The first paranasal sinus that I circled is the frontal sinus. The other one, that is the sphenoid sinus. Those are the couple of structures that you'll have to identify in lab when you get to that section of the lab book. Then we have the nasal cavity. I'm going to circle it right here. The floor of the nasal cavity is right there. That's where we have the palatine and part of the maxillary bone creates the palate. So the palate separates the nasal cavity from the oral cavity. And then we have some bones inside that are called concha. We have a superior, middle, and an inferior concha. So here's the superior, middle, and there's the inferior concha. And they're all lined with the respiratory mucosa. So as air enters through the nostrils, it circulates through these openings called choanae, but we're not going to worry about that term. The air circulates around the concha, and then it helps humidify and warm the air before it goes down into the pharynx. We can see the tonsils better in this picture than we could in the lymphatic system. There are 3 tonsils. There's one right up here that's in the nasopharynx. Those are the pharyngeal tonsils, also known as the adenoids. So the pharyngeal tonsil, adenoids, are located behind the nasal cavity in the nasopharynx. Then we have these tonsils, which are located right next to the palate. Those are the palatine tonsils. They're located in the oropharynx, which is the part of the pharynx behind the oral cavity. And then we have these tonsils right here, which are in the tongue, and those are the lingual tonsils. Whenever you have a tonsillectomy, they remove your tonsils. They're going to remove the palatine tonsils first, and then if they need to, they can remove the adenoids, the pharyngeal tonsils, and then again, the lingual tonsils are not removed because they're actually a part of your tongue. Right now we have 3 parts to the pharynx. The pharynx is the open passageway behind the nasal cavity, behind the oral cavity, and right above the larynx, or right behind and above the larynx. So the nasopharynx is going to be between these brackets right here. So nasopharynx. That is the pharynx that's behind the nasal cavity. Then we have the oropharynx, which is going to be that area right there, behind the oral cavity, and then the laryngopharynx, which is going to be right behind and above the larynx, which is going to be your voice box. In case you didn't get it down earlier, the respiratory mucosa, that's the PCCE, pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, and they line most of the airways. If it's not going to be pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, it could be stratified squamous, and that's going to be those areas that are shared between air or food, depending whether it's part of the digestive or the respiratory system. And then the pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, as we go through the bronchial tree, we get into lower and lower and into the lungs, it changes into a simple columnar to a simple cuboidal, and eventually it becomes the alveolar simple squamous cells. All right, the paranasal sinuses we mentioned earlier that help lighten the weight of your head, plus also provides a resonating chamber for your voice. The paranasal sinuses are located in those bones that surround your nose, like the frontal bone, the maxillary bone, the sphenoid bone, and the ethmoid bone. All of them contain sinuses, and they are part of your paranasal sinuses. And the sinuses do open into the nasal cavity. These are the sinuses that can get clogged with mucus if you're fighting some sort of respiratory infection or have a sinus infection. Typically, they're going to be in the frontal bone or in the maxillary bone. It's not as common to get them in the sphenoid or the ethmoid bone, seeing as how those are more internal inside of the skull. I mentioned this earlier, 3 sections of the pharynx. First of all, where is the pharynx? The pharynx is between the nasal cavity and the oral cavity and the larynx, which is your voice box. So there are 3 sections to the pharynx: the nasopharynx, which is behind the nasal cavity, the oropharynx, which is behind the oral cavity, and the laryngopharynx, which is going to be right above and behind the larynx, which is your voice box. The nasopharynx is for air only. That means this part of the pharynx is lined with pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, not stratified squamous epithelium. There's a part of the palate, it's called the soft palate. And the soft palate has a part that hangs down called the uvula. And whenever you swallow food or water, the uvula will lift up and it closes off the nasopharynx so that whatever you swallow goes down and into the esophagus, not up and into your nose. The tonsils that are located in the nasopharynx, they are the pharyngeal tonsils, also known as your adenoids. Now, the oropharynx is a shared pathway. It is shared by air if you're using the respiratory system, or if you are swallowing food and water, then it's also a part of the digestive system and the alimentary canal. Any type of tube that is shared between water, food, and air is lined with stratified squamous epithelium, not pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, not the PCCE, just stratified squamous epithelium. The tonsils that are located in the oropharynx, we have the palatine tonsils. They're located real close to the palate, and then the lingual tonsils, which are actually a part of the tongue. The laryngopharynx is the last part of the pharynx that's shared between food and air, so it is also lined with stratified squamous epithelium. There are no tonsils located in the laryngopharynx. The next section of the respiratory passages is the larynx. And the larynx is your voice box. It contains your vocal cords, so that when they are closed and air passes through the vocal cords, it produces a sound which is going to be your voice. So functions of the larynx include voice production, plus it's a passageway for air. And then there's a piece of cartilage that's going to direct whether air is going into the lungs or food is going into the esophagus. And this part of the larynx that controls that is called the epiglottis. There are 9 different cartilages associated with the larynx, but we're only going to talk about a couple of them. The thyroid cartilage is a prominent cartilage that is on the anterior surface of the larynx and the voice box. It's called the thyroid cartilage because it's right above that gland known as the thyroid. Then we have the epiglottis. The epiglottis is an elastic cartilage, and anything that is made of elastic cartilage is able to change shape and then spring back to its original shape. So the epiglottis is going to bend over and cover the airway every time you swallow, so that the food or water that you swallow goes down and into the esophagus and not down into the trachea. So the epiglottis has to be able to bend over and then straighten back up. There are 2 types of folds of tissue that are inside of the larynx. They're either vocal folds or they are vestibular folds. The vocal folds are known as true vocal cords because they actually make some sort of sound. If you put 2 rubber bands together and blow air through them and they vibrate, it creates a sound that would be your voice. So vocal folds are your true vocal cords. Right above the vocal folds are the vestibular folds, and they're known as your false vocal cords. They're there just for protection. They do not make any kind of sound that makes like your voice would make. The opening between the vocal folds is called glottis. So Glottis, glottis. That is the opening between the vocal folds, which is why the epiglottis, which is above it, folds over it whenever you swallow. The inner lining of the larynx is actually 2 types of tissues. The superior part, the upper part of the larynx, is lined with stratified squamous epithelium, because it is possible for some liquid or solid foods to pass by the upper part of the larynx. So it is lined with stratified squamous epithelium. The rest of it is going to be the PCCE, the pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. We can go ahead and fill in some of these lines. The body of the hyoid is located right there. The epiglottis is going to be right there. And then we have the thyroid cartilage, which is right here. Now I want to point out this part of the thyroid cartilage, which I haven't mentioned yet. That is called the laryngeal prominence. So the laryngeal prominence is where in the front part of the thyroid cartilage comes together and forms the Adam's apple. The Adam's apple is going to be more prominent in males than it is in females. And then we have another type of cartilage down here called cricoid cartilage. Cricoid means a ring, basically. It kind of looks like a cardinal ring. So the cricoid cartilage does go around to the back as well. And then we have, after that, the tracheal cartilage. So the trachea starts right here. And then we have rings of hyaline cartilage that keep the trachea open. Okay, so this is a sagittal section through the larynx. we're going to draw some lines to these parts. So the epiglottis is right there. That is the piece of elastic cartilage that covers the glottis every time you swallow. And then we also have the cricoid cartilage, which we can see right there. We can see a little bit of the cricoid cartilage as well right there, but we focus on cricoid cartilage in that location right there. And then we have tracheal cartilage underneath it right here. All right. Okay, what else can we see? Then we have the different folds inside of the larynx. We have the vestibular fold, which is going to be layers of tissues above the vocal cords and help protect it. Stays closed whenever you are eating or swallowing, and then they open back up just when you're breathing. And then we also have your true vocal cords, which are right below the glottis, right there. The vestibular folds, I'm going to extend this line, and it's going to be right there. This picture might be kind of gross, but it is showing the inside part of the throat, the difference between a closed vocal cord and an open vocal cord. So the closed vocal cord's on the left. That's whenever air passes through it as you exhale or as you inhale, but it's easier as you exhale so that it produces the sound, which is your voice. And then this picture showing the open vocal cords so that air can move in and out easily. So how does your voice change pitch? Well, it changes pitch by either tightening or relaxing the vocal cords. If you make the vocal cords longer, which means they are tightening, then your voice pitch gets higher, so it produces a higher pitch to your voice. And then if you relax the vocal cords and allow them to completely relax, then your voice can get lower. All right, the next part of the bronchial tree is the trachea. The trachea is your windpipe. The windpipe goes all the way down into the thoracic cavity. So the trachea extends from the larynx all the way down to a part called the carina. The carina is where the trachea ends, and it splits into two primary bronchi, a right bronchus and a left bronchus. There are incomplete rings of cartilage, so they are C-shaped rings of cartilage, and it keeps the trachea open. Those rings or C-shaped rings of cartilage are hyaline cartilage. And then the two ends of the C-shaped cartilage are connected by a muscle called the trachealis. So the trachealis is a piece of muscle that connects the two ends of the C-shaped hyaline cartilage. And whenever the trachealis contracts, it narrows the opening of the trachea, which means it increases resistance to airflow and it slows the airflow down. And then the trachea is lined with pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. This is a good picture showing you the cross-section of the esophagus and the trachea next to each other. So the esophagus is posterior and the trachea is anterior. So the trachea is in front of the esophagus. The opening of the lumen where the air is traveling, I'm going to point to them right here. It is lined with an inner mucosal epithelium known as a pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. And then we have the ring of cartilage in the middle. And then on the outside we have a fibrous connective tissue. It's an adventitia. Anytime you see the word adventitia, that means those tissues encroach upon the other tissues that surround it, and it's an anchoring tissue so that the trachea doesn't flop around inside of the thoracic cavity or inside of your throat. This bottom picture is kind of neat. It looks like a bunch of mop hairs. That's going to be the cilia that's located as part of the mucosa. The cilia will help propel a layer of mucus up and out of the oral cavity so that the dust and dirt that you breathe in that gets trapped in the mucus, then the cilia will beat that mucus so that it goes up and into the oral cavity so that you can either swallow it or spit it out. And as gross as it may seem, you usually swallow it. Let's look at a little bit of the bronchial tree. We see the trachea right here, and then where it splits right there, that's called the carina of the trachea. As soon as the trachea splits, it splits into right and left primary bronchi. If we follow the direction of this light, we're going to start right here with the trachea. Air goes into the trachea, then it goes into the primary bronchus. As soon as that primary bronchus splits, like right here and here, it becomes a secondary bronchus. And then a secondary bronchus leads to a tertiary bronchus. And the tertiary bronchus leads to a terminal bronchiole, and that's going to lead to an alveolar duct, which leads to the alveoli. So the airway passages start rather kind of largest at the trachea, and then as soon as it becomes a primary bronchus, they get into smaller and smaller passageways until eventually we get to the site of gas exchange at the respiratory membrane and the alveolus. What I want to mention about this when we talk about the different parts of the conducting zone, the bronchioles. The bronchioles, once we reach the bronchial level, there are no more hyaline cartilage plates. So there's no more of those C-shaped rings of cartilage. And now, instead of cartilage, it has got smooth muscle that surrounds it. And this will become important when we look at the respiratory system in physiology, because this is where we control how much air enters into the alveolus and leaves. If the smooth muscle contracts around the bronchiole, that's called bronchoconstriction, and it narrows the lumen and it limits how much air reaches the alveolus. During bronchodilation, the smooth muscle relaxes and it opens up the airways of the bronchiole so you can get more air into and out of the alveoli. So the sympathetic nervous system causes bronchodilation. The parasympathetic nervous system causes bronchoconstriction. When it comes to the respiratory zone, we are just going to focus on the alveolar sacs. But the respiratory bronchioles lead to alveolar ducts, which then eventually lead to the alveolar sacs. And that's what we're going to look at right now. This is a picture showing you the clusters of alveoli around the alveolar duct. The picture on the left is showing you the different respiratory bronchioles, plus also all of those lines that kind of look like crooked lines, like around in here. Those are the alveoli. Those are the sacs for gas exchange. There are 3 cell types located in the alveoli. There's one called the type 1 alveolar cell. There's also type 2 alveolar cells, and then there are macrophages. The type 1 alveolar cell is a simple squamous epithelium. If we can remember back to chapter 4, simple means one layer of cells. Squamous means that they are all flat. So these are perfect cells for gas exchange, and they are a part of the respiratory membrane. We'll go over the rest of the parts of the respiratory membrane later, but first part of it is going to be the type 1 alveolar cell. The type 2 alveolar cell is a cuboid shaped. They are simple cuboidal cells. And anytime you have a cube-shaped cell, that means it's secreting something. It's something into a duct or something into the bloodstream. In this case, it's secreting a substance called surfactant. And surfactant, the function of surfactant is to reduce surface tension within the alveoli. But what does that mean? In order to reduce surface tension, that means you make them not stick, which means they don't collapse. If we didn't have surfactant on the inside of the alveoli, and then whenever you breathe out, the walls of the alveoli will stick together, it would be a lot harder to breathe in to get the air into the alveoli. So surfactant is like a detergent. It's like a lubricant, and it prevents the walls of the alveoli from sticking. And then the third type of cell found in the alveoli are macrophages. Because even though you have a layer of mucus to help trap dust and dirt that you breathe in, some particles will still reach the alveoli, and you want to protect the alveoli. So there are macrophages located in around the alveolar sacs to help get rid of that stuff that would damage the alveolus. This is showing you the different structures that we just named and also part of the pulmonary circulation. So we have smooth muscle right there located around the bronchioles. Whenever they constrict, they narrow the lumen to limit how much air is going in. And then we have the alveoli, which are the air sacs, right there. Then we have the capillaries. Remember the pulmonary arteries lead to pulmonary capillaries carrying the oxygen poor blood And then the pulmonary capillaries lead to the pulmonary venules and pulmonary veins, which lead back to the heart, to the left atrium. All right, in this picture we can see the type 1 alveolar cell, which is going to be these right here, the simple squamous cells. Then we have the type 2 cells, which are going to be square-shaped cuboidal cells that secrete the surfactant. And then we have the alveolar air spaces, like right here and right here, where we can have air come in and we have gas exchange. This picture on the right-hand side is showing you the respiratory membrane. And the respiratory membrane, there are 3 parts to it. We have the alveolar epithelium, and then we have the basement membrane, and then we have the capillary endothelium. Those are the 3 parts of the respiratory membrane, which means those are the 3 parts that oxygen and carbon dioxide must pass through. So the alveolar epithelium is going to be right here. The basement membrane is going to be located right there, and the capillary endothelium is going to be right there. So we have oxygen that's going to go into the pulmonary circuit, and then we have carbon dioxide exiting the pulmonary circuit. All right, let's look at some lung anatomy. The lungs are basically pyramid-shaped organs or triangular-shaped organs, which means there's a base and an apex. The base of the lungs are going to be those that's closest to the diaphragm, so it's the bottom part, inferior surface. Where it comes to the point is in the very top, which is closest to the first rib. So the apex is superior, the base is inferior. Now, how does that differ from the heart? If we remember the heart back in chapter 19, the base of the heart is superior and the apex of the heart points down, so that is inferior. On the medial surface of the lungs, which means it faces towards the sternum, there's an area called the hilum. And the hilum of the lung is where we have the entry or exit of blood vessels. So that's where the pulmonary arteries go in and the pulmonary veins exit. And this is also where we have the primary bronchi, so we can breathe air into and out of the lungs. The lungs are separated into lobes. The left lung, which is on the left side of the patient, not whenever you're facing the patient, remember their left is on your right. So their left lung, there's only 2 lobes, so the superior and inferior lobe, and they're separated by fissures. The left lung is taller and skinnier than the right lung. The right lung is shorter and squatter, if you will, or thicker. And there are 3 lobes to the right lung. The reason why the right lung appears to be so much shorter than the left lung is because of the liver. The liver pushes up, so the right lung forms shorter than the left lung. So this is an easy picture to look at and read. We can see the right lung and the left lung. So right here's the right lung with 3 lobes. Here's superior lobe, middle, and inferior lobe. And then we have the left lung, a superior lobe, inferior lobe, and they're separated by fissures right here. You can lose 1 lobe of the lung and still be able to function normally. Go ahead and take note of these pleural membranes right here because we're about to look at it. There's a sac that surrounds each lung. It's called the pleural sac. One layer of the sac is on the surface of the lung. It's called the visceral pleural layer. And then there's a layer that's actually on the surface of the thoracic cavity, or if we go down here, it's on the outer surface of the diaphragm, and that's called the parietal pleura membrane. So this is what I was just talking about, the pleural sac that surrounds the lungs. We have a parietal pleura, which is the outer layer of the double layer sac. So it lines the surface of the thoracic cavity or on the outer surface of the diaphragm. And then the visceral pleura is going to be on the actual surface of the lungs. What it does is there's a potential space between the parietal and visceral pleura, and it's called the pleural cavity. And this potential space is filled with a fluid called a serous fluid. Serous, S-E-R-O-U-S. A serous fluid is a lubricant. You breathe in and breathe out all day long, whether you're awake or whether you're asleep. Whenever the lungs expand with air or contract when they're breathing out, then it causes friction. So if there wasn't a lubricant there, then the tissues of the lungs would rub up against the tissues of the thoracic cavity, rub up against the tissues of the diaphragm, and even more importantly, rub against the tissues of the heart. And the heart has its own thing going on. It's beating all the time. So it has its own sac around it called the pericardial sac or the pericardium. Anyway, with these two layers, with the lubricant between the two, the lungs are allowed to expand and contract all day long and not cause friction, not to rub, and so it doesn't cause any type of pain. Whenever there's an infection of the pleural membranes, it's called pleurisy or pleuritis, and it does cause friction and pain and heat every time you breathe in and breathe out. Let's talk about what happens to the thoracic cavity and the lungs and the diaphragm whenever you breathe in and breathe out, and that would be the parts of pulmonary ventilation. Whenever you inhale, it's called inhalation. Whenever you exhale, it's exhalation. The main muscle that is used for inhale or inspiration is the diaphragm. The diaphragm is the muscle that separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity. Whenever the diaphragm contracts, it flattens. When it flattens, that means it goes a little bit into the abdominal cavity. And whenever the diaphragm contracts and flattens, it decreases the amount of pressure inside of the thoracic cavity. The important concept, and we'll go over this in physiology, is that it decreases the pressure in the thoracic cavity lower than atmospheric pressure, and that forces air into the lungs and towards the alveoli. Now, the diaphragm is assisted by the intercostal muscles. Now, the intercostal muscles are separated into internal and external intercostal muscles. The external intercostal muscles will help you breathe in more air. It actually separates the lungs a little bit, which will help decrease the pressure inside the thoracic cavity even more. So those are the muscles used for regular inhale, regular inspiration. But then you can breathe in even more air. A forced air in or forced inhalation is known as a deep inspiration. So there are other muscles that are recruited to assist with the diaphragm and the external intercostals. We have the scalene muscles, which are between the cervical spine and the rib and the clavicle. And then we have the sternocleidomastoid muscle. It also pulls on the sternum and the first rib to help get more air into the lungs. The pectoralis minor muscle helps increase the thoracic cavity size, which decreases the pressure. Quadratus lumborum and erector spinae. Those are spinal muscles. And whenever you take a deep breath in, you kind of stretch out your back and stretch it back a little bit and allows more air into your lungs. You notice the difference. If you take a regular inhale and then force as much air as possible, you can definitely notice that you're using more muscles when you do the deep inhale. Exhaling or quiet expiration, they call that a passive process because there are no muscles required to exhale. It is a reflex. Whenever the diaphragm relaxes, it goes back to its original size, which goes back up and into the thoracic cavity and increases the pressure inside of the thoracic cavity by decreasing the volume. So whenever you increase the pressure inside of the thoracic cavity, you increase it above atmospheric pressure, and then air is forced out of the lungs and into the atmosphere. And this air is going to be heavily, or it's going to have more carbon dioxide than oxygen when you breathe out. Now then you have a forced exhale, which means you try to force as much air out of your lungs as possible. And the muscles recruited to help with a forced exhale are your abdominal muscles. So your abdominal muscles will help contract and push up into the thoracic cavity, which decreases the volume of the thoracic cavity, increases the pressure. So you can also use your internal and external oblique muscles. They're still all abdominal muscles for a forced exhale. The other muscles you use for a forced exhale are your internal intercostal muscles. All right, so that's the end of this chapter. This is the last chapter for Unit 4. Your exam will be on Thursday, April 16th. Email me if you have any questions.